Has your relationship hit a snag? Maybe your partner suddenly wants more and you like the way things are. Or maybe you're the one who wants more, but your partner is perfectly comfortable with the status quo. Or maybe when you started out, you both wanted the same things, but now it feels like you're going in different directions. Or maybe the stress of everyday life has taken its toll over the years, and now you're not so sure that the relationship is really built to last. But if it's a long term relationship, then you've probably invested a lot. And so you're confused about how seriously you should be addressing this conflict that has come up. Is this just a bump in the road, or have you arrived at a make or break moment in the entire relationship? So, if this is something that sounds familiar, then that is what we are going to be talking about in this video segment. So, we are going to explore a case study of a long term married couple that has stuck it out through thick and thin, but they feel as though they have reached a crossroads in their marriage. And so, through this case example, we are going to examine how to identify the strengths of a relationship and build upon them, a resistance to distance, and why sometimes distance can actually bring you closer, the impact of stressful togetherness and enmeshed family systems, how to recognize two types of emotional dismissal, and how to get unstuck in your relationship. Now, before we dive into all of that, if you are new to my online community, welcome. My name is Brianna McWilliam, and I am a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist with more than 15 years in the field, helping adults struggling with insecure attachment go from self-doubting to self-sovereign so they can attract the soul-shaking, passionate partnerships that they want. And I do this using a psycho-spiritual approach to creative arts interventions, which I call the McWilliam Method. The content on my YouTube channel is derived from my online courses, which you can learn more about through the link in the caption of this video. If you would like to learn more about your attachment style, you can take the 4-question quiz. If you like what you see and hear and you want to learn more, make sure you like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. I put up videos once a week, and I wouldn't want you to miss out. So I would like to begin by reading a question that I paraphrased from one of our online community members. I'm going to refer to this person as Jane. So that's not their real name, but I'm going to use the name Jane. Her question involves navigating a crossroads in her marriage to her husband, who I'm just going to call John. And this is the question as I have paraphrased it. My husband is depressed and anxious and says he's conflicted about being in this marriage. It would be a difficult divorce because we have 3 kids and a business together. Additionally, our middle child is a cancer survivor. He has agreed to 9 months of therapy, but I feel like he is dismissive of the process and often doesn't use the space to properly discuss his feelings. What do I do? How do we get unstuck? I've tried many things to improve myself in this relationship, but it only seems to make things worse and or fall flat. I've accepted that he has to be in charge of his journey, so how can I take charge of mine as I move forward? So first off, I want to thank you, Jane, for posting your question and sharing a bit of your experience with us. This is a very layered question, and there are a lot of things to unravel here. So please know that I am doing this with a gentle empathy towards you and your situation, but I am going to try to assume a more objective stance. So in this analysis, I am going to offer to help you contextualize what you might be experiencing. So the first one that I want to look at is the strengths of this inquiry. So there are a lot of good things to acknowledge in this question, and I want to pay homage to those things first. So the first thing is that I'm going to speak directly to Jane since she posed the question. Your husband is being honest about his feelings, even if they are ambivalent feelings, which means that you are having authentic emotional conversations, even if they're not perfect. And that means that he trusts you well enough to do that. You both have taken action steps towards addressing the conflict in your marriage, including 9 months of therapy, which is a significant show of commitment in and of itself. And it's a lot better than living in denial of something. I think that this demonstrates that both of you are at least somewhat motivated to learn how to prioritize each other's needs and concerns so that the relationship can evolve or even dissolve in a healthy way. Your husband seems to know exactly what he needs in order to gain clarity around what direction he wants to take moving forward, which means that even if he is ambivalent and indecisive, at least he's clear on what he needs to get clear on what he wants, right? So it seems like you've arrived at a point in the process and in your relationship that you are willing to relinquish a need for control and surrender to the fact that there are certain things that he will need to figure out for himself that you cannot do for him. And so, in granting your husband this permission, you're actually also granting yourself permission to focus on your own journey first, which is where you ended this question. So that way you can get clear on what you individually want and need, right? And so you are now starting to ask yourself, how can I take charge of my own life moving forward? Now, the irony is, once you start asking this question, you actually have arrived at a place where it is increasingly possible to create space for your husband to move towards you again. And why is that? Well, because you've stopped kind of frantically trying to fill up the space between you with a sort of fix it energy, because that will inevitably keep him at a distance at the same time while you're trying to pull him closer. So, those are some really positive things that I see here in this question. And I want to start by pointing those out as a foundation upon which we can explore the rest of this analysis. Okay. But before we do, to the rest of everybody watching and wondering, how can I recognize the strengths in my own relationship? I want to give you a few questions for you to assess your relationship and get you started. So, first, are you both able to be honest about your feelings, even if you suspect that it might displease your spouse? Okay. Do you trust your spouse to listen to you and be responsive without tearing down your character or hitting below the belt, even if they are upset? Are conflicts openly addressed in your relationship, or are they ignored and swept under the rug as if nothing ever happened? Are both partners' needs held in equal priority in the relationship? If a conflict is identified, are you able to come up with co-creative solutions and take action steps to remedy the situation? Are you able to discern when your partner is struggling with something that you can help them with versus when it is something that it is better to let them figure it out on their own? Okay. Do you lose your sense of self and identity in a relationship, or are you able to maintain your own autonomous sense of individuality, passions, and pursuits, even though you're coupled? Okay. Are you able to articulate why it is that you want the relationship to succeed and what it is that you really love about your partner? Okay. So I would say that if you can answer yes to a majority of these questions, then there really is a solid foundation upon which to work through conflicts in relationships, so long as both parties are motivated to do so, right? And optimistically, I would say that this is really true of our couple here, example couple here, Jane and John. Okay. So now the second observation has to do with examining where in the relationship is there contracted energy. Jane says, he thinks the only solution is to take time apart, but I don't like that, in essence. Okay. So, as I said before, it is self-aware of John to know that he has conflicted feelings, and it's good that he's being honest about that with Jane. So, Jane included in her question, which I didn't include in the paraphrase. John thinks that if he leaves, he can figure it out. If he leaves and wants to come back or doesn't want to come back, then he has his answer. But Jane doesn't really seem to like this idea because she kind of pushes against that statement by saying to John, well, why not try changing small things like the relationship expert says instead? So she's kind of pushing against what he's expressing while at the same time trying to pull him closer with a practical recommendation, right? Now, objectively speaking, Jane may be offering very good and sound advice right now. And perhaps John has a habit of running away of facing problems and needs to challenge himself to kind of ride out the conflict a little bit. But in this exchange, we might assume that John is feeling unheard and like the immediate offer of a solution is actually a way of dismissing what he needs. Because then he pulls back, according to Jane's report, he pulls back and he says, I don't know if I'd be able to tell if any of those things, any of those recommendations are working anyway, which means that it's going to fail. So when he says this, it tells me that he's feeling unable to access a sense of self and identity well enough to assume an objective perspective and see any progress in the relationship in its own context. And he's resisting any practical suggestions on how to get past his own negative assumptions. right? So, in other words, he's so bogged down in a heavy, thick, dark, rigid, and contracted type of energy within him. And he's not able to see the forest from the trees anymore, emotionally speaking. And when you try to pull that type of energy out of its cave, it's only going to bear down on its weight even more. And it's going to become increasingly dense and closed off. So instead of jumping to a practical solution, which is only going to be pulling at an immovable darkness, we might try exploring his experience of that darkness and how and why he thinks that space will inevitably change that state. Okay. Also, how is he even defining space? Because that's a rather vague word. What feeling does he think that the space is going to afford him? Has he ever had that feeling within the relationship before? When and how? Has he ever had that feeling outside of the relationship before? When and how? What were the circumstances? How and why did it change? And is it possible to have enough of that feeling, which we are equating with space, without leaving the relationship entirely? So, my point is that it's important to slow way down here so that the co creative solution finding process is really more likely to satisfy what John really needs. He needs to be a part of the process, right? He needs to be a part of finding solutions, while at the same time softening the threat that Jane feels in the moment in response to his desire for space. What does that look like? Well, maybe on an annual or biannual basis, Aunt, Uncle, or Auntie Jane or a grandparent comes and they're going to hang with the kids while John and help Jane while John takes 2 weeks vacation alone or with his friends. And then later in the year, Jane takes her turn, right? Or maybe they hire a babysitter 2 nights a week. One night is independent activities, and the other night it's just a date night with the two of them, right? So there are a lot of ways that you could create individual spaciousness in a relationship in a more consistent way that prevents the building up of the kind of anxiety and depression someone feels when they haven't had enough me time, right? In which case, it is possible that the time spent apart actually is good for everyone involved, at least so long as the responsibilities are evenly shared and accounted for, obviously. Now, this brings me to my third observation, which pertains to the nature of the time spent together. Jane says, we have 3 kids and we run a business together. That is where I feel like it's important to insert these observations. So Jane mentions that not only do they have these 3 kids, but they have a business together. And this can lead to a lot of stressful togetherness as opposed to pleasurable togetherness. It also doesn't leave a lot of time to explore pleasurable individual passions and pursuits. Add to that, there was a trauma indicated of a child struggling with cancer. Now, this makes me wonder if there might be somewhat of an enmeshed quality to the family system with some complicated grief thrown in the mix, meaning that a lot of confusion over whose feelings belong to who and assuming disproportionate responsibility for managing other family members' thoughts, feelings, and decisions so that everything goes smoothly. Okay. Now, I want to emphasize having a child that is a survivor of cancer, that is a trauma. That is a trauma. It's one that warrants profound feelings of fear, helplessness, anxiety, stress, and depression. And when things like that happen, necessarily there are obligations that have to be met, which can distract from one's own sense of well-being as an individual when you are a primary caregiver. And there are also tremendous stresses and experiences of grief over what I'm going to call little losses that can occur all along the way that need to be processed in order to move on, such as the grief over your child not having some of those normal childhood experiences. And even as parents, having additional financial, emotional, physical, and mental stressors that other parents don't have to deal with, maybe not in their entire lifetime. And so, in reflecting on these difficult times, Jane makes a comment. Do I look back on those years and cling to her worst days? No. I remember how strong and courageous and playful she was through a terrible experience. Now, this sounds like a lovely sentiment and a wonderful, positive reframe to adopt. But gently, I'm going to suggest and I'm going to offer that before you can jump to that, okay, And I'm not saying this is what happened, but in many cases, before we can jump to that, to make sure that you have processed all the difficult stuff that you went through as well, it's really important that you do that. Because if you jump too quickly to, I only focus on the good stuff, before you have intentionally and conscientiously allowed yourself to feel and process all the painful bad stuff, it can amount to suppression, repression, and denial of a certain type of emotional energy that has now become constricted within you. Because it's not really bad stuff, is it? It's guidance. It's guidance gleaned from the dimensionality of the human experience. It's a wound of wisdom. And the most positive position that we can assume is adopting the idea that the difficult stuff is just as important to learn from. So if you have never openly, and this is a general you, if you've never openly and intentionally acknowledged and processed what difficult experiences you have had, then the energy has to go somewhere. Okay. Now, perhaps John struggles with anxiety and depression because historically he's had a similar habit. Okay. And now it's starting to kind of seep through the cracks. And so he's become what is referred to as, in family therapy, the identified patient, which means he's kind of singled out as causing a lot of problems, but he's actually acting out an underlying problem that is fueled by the entire family system. And how does something like that happen? So that's going to bring me to my fourth observation, and this revolves around two types of emotional dismissal. Now, I'm going to venture to guess that there's also some emotional dismissal going on in the relationship generally on both sides, and it's going to demonstrate itself in two very different ways. Now, the first way is obvious. Jane identifies it when she indicates that John closes down in therapy sessions. He seems to avoid too much emotional openness in the session, and that's why they're there. Why is he not taking advantage of this? And this is the way that we are largely trained to identify emotional unavailability and dismissal in our partners. But it is not the only way that emotional dismissal manifests itself. So the second way is a more subtle form of dismissal, and it is articulated in the way that Jane minimizes the stress in their lives and puts a lot of energy into correcting what she feels must be wrong about herself or wrong about the relationship. So, for example, Jane says, my husband says most of our interactions are negative, but I don't feel this way. I just feel the stress of raising kids, running a business, and life in general. So this statement points towards an incompatibility in the perception around what makes a pleasurable experience in an intimate emotional exchange. So Jane might be someone who takes the stress of raising kids, running a business, and experiencing a trauma like that in stride. But maybe John is someone who's more sensitive to these stressors. So he experiences Jane's kind of what he perceives to be a sort of c'est la vie attitude as kind of dismissive of the impact these things have had on his emotional well-being and their relationship. And then that's going to color the majority of their interactions as negative in his mind. And maybe unconsciously, then he kind of gets back at her by dismissing her in therapy because that's what she wants him to do, right? And so as an aside, just to play devil's advocate, raising 3 kids, running a business, and surviving cancer is a tremendous amount of stress, more than most people are going to have to deal with in their lifetime, okay? So John's dismissal is more obviously demonstrated through emotional resistance in therapy. It's identifiable, right? Whereas Jane's dismissal is less obviously demonstrated through a kind of we can do it, let's fix this attitude that kind of wants to get over things before you've had a chance to sit with and process them. And these are a lot of assumptions I'm making. I have not met Jane. She's just submitted her question, and I'm making some assumptions to make a point. Okay, so to Jane, take what fits and forget the rest. However, we do know that Jane is trying to evolve in her habits because, number one, she brought them into therapy. She's asking bigger questions of herself. She purchased a course to be able to ask this question of me. So she's actively engaging with the growth process, right? Now, both forms of these dismissal can lead to complicated grief, especially somaticized symptoms in the body. And John would have to be experiencing symptoms in his body in order to get a diagnosis of depression or anxiety. Okay. So looking at this through family systems theory again, maybe John has unconsciously taken on some of Jane's unprocessed pain and grief as well as his own, in which case we might be able to understand why he feels he can't make his own decisions unless he creates separation from her. Okay. Now, if this is the case, it can create an emotional disconnect between them while at the same time serving to keep the family functioning in the ways that it has had to in order to survive a traumatic time. So, in other words, the family system is kind of exhausted from operating in kind of a perpetual low grade survival mode, but it has become the only way that it knows how to operate. So, we might ask both of them if deep down there is a traumatized part of them that still believes we are not out of the woods yet. We have to keep a stiff upper lip and keep calm and carry on in order to make this work, in order to be strong for our children. Right. And so, on one hand, maybe that unconscious thought propels Jane to sort of anxiously find what tools and resources she can to patch things up quickly, because you need to, right? While on the other hand, it's compelling John to seek space in the form of time and distance from that fearful and helpless anxiety that urgent voice is creating within him. Okay. And so this brings me to the fifth observation, which is, how do we get unstuck? So how do John and Jane get unstuck? So I want to go back to the point about, I'm going to say, the point of attraction between them, which is another way of saying that there is a similar string being plucked in their energy, which is keeping them together, but also creating friction between them. Okay. And I'm going to define this as a similar limiting belief in energy that might have them coping in equal but opposite ways, right? This unconscious belief that we're not out of the woods yet, have to keep a stiff upper lip and keep calm and carry on in order to make this work. Okay. So for both of them, it would be important to consider, where does that thought form and that energy live in my body? How has it served me? Because it has. If it's there, it's served you in some way. How might it now be impeding the relationship between me and my spouse, or between me and me? What do I want to feel now? Does that energy move me towards or away from what I ultimately want to feel? What resources do I have to work with shifting that energy? And what commitments and action steps can I take in the direction of the feeling that I want to feel today? Okay. So, altogether, this is a process of what I call cognitive reframing, which allows you to name and claim these previously unconscious but powerful beliefs and energy that can compel us in the ways that we've just illustrated, right? So, in naming and claiming that energy, we can give it shape, we can give it form and personality so that it might be addressed openly enough that we can release some of the constricted energy that has collected itself around, right? So, internal family systems theory refers to this as a self part, the form that energy, that thought, that belief assumes is kind of like a self part. Okay. A self part that is acting like a manager or a protector to the more helpless, fearful, grieving, or guilty feelings or parts that have been exiled to the unconscious. And this kind of exile we would refer to as the wounded inner child, right? The child that is like, oh my God, how am I now responsible for a child that's struggling with cancer? And how can I be there for them? How can I be the best thing that they need right now? And then still be scared, and then still be worried about the bills, and then still be concerned how it's going to affect your relationship, and still have all these other things. So the self parts become split, and they have to interact with each other in these ways. And the part that becomes the adulting one, right, has to manage the parts that just need to crumble into a heap, right? So you may have become aware through things like self-help and personal development that maybe you have a wounded inner child that is compelling you on this unconscious level. But what you may not realize is that just because you're willing to talk to that child, it doesn't mean that it wants to talk to you. It also doesn't mean that there isn't this other more adulting protective part that doesn't think that you should have that conversation. And this is what internal family systems theory calls the manager, right? Functions as a protector. So it steps in and it resists or it dismisses any need to feel those feelings because it's threatening. It would rather have you focus on the problem and get into kind of fix it mode, because that keeps you kind of safely tucked away in a place that's a more protected, okay, less exposed, less vulnerable. Now, The problem with trying to establish a loving connection with a partner through the lens of problem solving is that you only wind up adding more energy and focus and momentum to what you think is wrong about the relationship. So, research from the Gottman Institute has shown that when we focus on the content of the problem, we actually wind up feeling increasingly frustrated, insecure, and alienated in our relationships. Instead, I suggest adding in fun, playfulness, creativity, and nonverbal communication as a place to start establishing or reestablishing a loving and secure foundation with your partner before tackling these painful issues. So, once you're on more secure footing and you're very clear about why you want to remain with this partner, then you can dive into the harder stuff and decode those triggering verbal statements that send us on these roller coasters in love. So, in my work as a creative arts therapist, that usually means that we're going to start off track from where your irritated energy wants to begin, right? So, for example, a problem solving session might look like this. You identify what's wrong in the relationship. You make sure to assign blame and accountability to whomever the perpetrator might be. You learn a whole lot of new language and vocabulary for expressing yourself. You elicit the necessary apologies, and then you go home feeling kind of exhausted, ashamed, angry, and tongue-tied and wondering, am I doing it right? Right? Not that there aren't things that you can glean from those experiences, because there are, but there's an alternative way to approach this. So let's say, what if you were to have a creative solution session, and it might look like this. Instead, you start off holding hands and breathing together. You express why you want to be in this relationship, and you set an intention to value each other's needs with equal priority. You agree not to talk about your problem for at least the first 15 to 20 minutes and only talk about things that you love about each other and that you appreciate about your relationship. Then I would have some art materials out on the table. You would pick from the materials a couple of your favorite colors. Then you would both have a piece of large butcher block paper, and you decide amongst yourselves on 3 rules that you will both have to follow. One that each of you came up with and one that you came up with together. And then you both draw on the page following those rules. Okay. And maybe you're listening to your song in the background, right? Now, after this exercise, you've processed the experience, you're talking with each other, you're collaborating, you're working on something creative and outside the realms of your problem. Now we can start to look at the problem and discuss the original sticking point. But realize that you're both energetically going to be in a very, very different place. Okay. And you will have exercised your brain and your body in ways that integrate you on a bilateral level and also can yield creative and unanticipated solutions. Okay. So that's just to give you an example. If you want to learn more about that and other directives like it, then I encourage you to check out my course. It's called Relationship Rescue, a toolkit for healthy communication in unstable relationships. And I will include a link to that in the caption of this video. Now, if you're like Jane and you're not sure if you could get your partner on board with something like that right away, but you want to start practicing some exercises for yourself so you can be working on establishing your own equilibrium and footing and focus on yourself in a healthy way, then I invite you to check out a video I have on my YouTube channel. It's about secure attachment and art therapy techniques. I'll also include a link to that in the caption of this video as well. If you like that and you want to take it further, I recommend my course, Healing Attachment Wounds with Creative Arts Interventions. Okay, and again, I'll include links to all of these things in the caption of the video. So to summarize my response to this first question, figuring out how to get unstuck in a long-term relationship is going to involve a couple of steps. So the first step is assessing the strength of the relationship and figuring out how to build upon those strengths. The second step is looking at where the energy is constricted in the relationship and why this can help you reframe your approach to conflict, seeing it as less of a problem and more of a creative opportunity to deepen the intimacy between you and your partner. Then you want to consider the nature of the time that you spend together. How has the family system served to support each member in their own individual passions, as well as creating space and permission for everyone to have and to express their feelings? Where might there be emotional dismissal going on, and how can that be relaxed and softened so that deeper connections can be made? And finally, getting unstuck in the relationship is going to involve a shifting from a problem-focused orientation to a playful exploration of co-creative solutions. And so even if your partner is not on board with exploring that right away, you can always commit to creatively repairing the relationship between you and you. In other words, between you and your own inner child today. And that is always going to create dramatic shifts, whether you are single or partnered. Now, on a positive note, our couple here has demonstrated a strong foundation upon which they might be able to grow and evolve together beyond the current conflict, whether that is as a rekindled relationship or a healthy and conscious decoupling. And truly, both paths are equally valuable in the larger context of spiritual growth for everyone involved. Okay. So again, to learn more about the suggested resources here, I'm going to include a couple of links in the caption of this video once we finish recording. And if this content resonates with you, I'd love it if you'd just leave me a thumbs up or a comment letting me know your thoughts and feelings on this topic.